Okay, we are about to start. Welcome everybody. Hi Ciro, hi Jesse. We are really pleased and it's a real honor to have Jesse Reiser with us today. We're launching the first exhibition as part of a series of exhibitions that we're going to have this semester. Are going to be both physically in the gallery of the Estudios Di Tella, and both as well as in the Di Tella Architecture Universe or Universo Di Tella Arquitectura. That's our virtual platform, really interesting virtual platform. So I will make a brief introduction to the exhibition, and then I will hand it on to Ciro and Jesse, that they're going to have I'm sure, a very interesting conversation. Ciro Najle is the dean of our school. He also is the professor at thesis level, and Jesse Reiser is director of rural architecture. But let me say that we know that Ciro and Jesse know each other and have a history of their own for some long time, and I would say that somehow Ciro has extended the affection to Jesse to many of us, and maybe to the whole of the school and the project of the school. So once again, we are very pleased to have Jesse with us, and double pleasure to have Ciro and Jesse talking and discussing about architecture. So I will start the presentation. So the exhibition is about the book Projects Under Consequences, a book by rural architecture that was first published in 2019. And yeah, I'm going to the next, slowly going to the next slide. Okay, so this is the leaflet of the exhibition, where we have the book cover, and in the plan of the Di Tella studio, we can see that the exhibition is in the North Gallery in 16 panels actually, and we're opening this exhibition today, and we're kindly inviting everybody to visit the exhibition. I think it's a great opportunity to see it and to have a first sneak peek of the book. So basically what we did for the exhibition is a bit simple. We used the spreads of the book, and we spread them or unfolded them following the structure of the book. The book has obviously the cover and the spine and the back cover. That is the first spread that you can see here, and it has a front matter and a credits chapter, and in between it has 5 chapters. The first one is the introduction. The second one is the textual projects and narrative. The third chapter is material diagram and scapes. The fourth chapter is infrastructure and territories, and the fifth chapter is cultural institutions and environments. Each chapter has lots of different projects and essays and interviews and diagrams and plates and drawings. So it's a very rich book in that sense. And we selected certain spreads, and we used the first panel for the book cover, the back cover and the spine, and the last panel for a sort of epilogue, the contents of the index of the book and the credits of the book. And in between, we use the first and second row to put spreads of projects, and the last row are essays and interviews and diagrams. So these are the images of the exhibition that is currently in the gallery at Di Tella. These are the first 16 panels, and these are the sorry, the first 8 panels. And we go to the next slide. We go to the next slide. These are the second 8 panels. Okay, so this is the physical exhibition. Once again, we invite everybody at the school and the public to visit the exhibition. And now let me go to the virtual exhibition that is, as I said, situated located in the Universo Di Tella Arquitectura. So here we are in the center of the exhibition. Basically, this is a Borromini exhibition that is in the studio currently at the center of the studio. And now we're gonna go to one of the worlds, that is the world of projects and their consequences. We're going to one of these worlds that is basically different pixels, and on each side of the pixel we have the panels. This is the first of them, that is the flyer, where we can see the content of each panel. And this, as we saw earlier, is the leaflet, also known as tarjetón. And this is the back side of the leaflet. Okay. And then we have the first panel with the introduction to the exhibition, both the exhibition and the book, and the cover of the book. Then on this first panel, we have the project Villa Farsetti and the preface. And yes, this is the mnemonic theater and the essay It Could Always Be Otherwise, with an amazing title and very interesting content. This is the London project, the Globe Theatre, and in the bottom row, the plates. We're going now, traveling to Eero Makia Ibnia House, a project from 1998, and the essay Drawing Matter. So this is the Yokohama Port Terminal from 1995 competition, and an essay called Jesse Reiser on Aldo Rossi, with a drawing by Jesse. This is a Kansai library and the essay No Place Like Home. This is a project Water Garden, and the essay Semiotex Architecture Nausea Crisis A Way Forward. West Side Convergence, a project from 1999, and the essay is Smoothly Striated. The Sagaponack House, and the Surface Project, with an interview that Greg Lynn made to Jesse and Nanako. And this is the Alishan tourist routes. In this case, the 3 of the spreads are from that project. The IIT Student Center from 1998, and the essay project on infrastructural urbanism. The Children's Museum of Pittsburgh from 2001, and a conversation that Andrew Benjamin had with Jesse and Nanako. This is the new museum from 2003, Typologies and Singularities, an essay that uses, I think, part of a very interesting book, Atlas of Novel Tectonics. This is University of Applied Arts in Vienna from 2012, and the Mixed Media and Digital Matter essays. And this is the end of the exhibition, where, okay, there we go. Yeah, where we can see Jesse and Nanako, I think, is a drawing that some students of yours made some time ago, and the contents of the book and the credits. So, okay, I think the book is great, and the exhibition is is good because the book is great, and we invite everybody both to the physical exhibition, the virtual exhibition. At the end of this conversation, we're gonna be putting the link so everybody can go in. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Ciro and Jesse.
Okay. Thank you, Manuel. And maybe I will share screen. Just a moment. Welcome, Jesse, to the school again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you personally, but also it's a collective pleasure to have you at the school once again. Last time you were here, you were giving the lab, and that was a very intense experience for both of us, I believe. Very nice one, or for the three of us, together with Nanako as well. Even if she was at distance, she was very much in touch with you and with us all the time. And it was also very nice to see the mobilization that it produced at the school. So thank you again for being here, Jesse.
Well, thank you, Ciro. I mean, it's a pleasure, to speak with you again, and Di Tella is one of my favorite places on earth. So it's a delight, really, to be part of it.
Thank you. So maybe just to kick off our conversation, I'm going to share screen with the cover of the book. So, well, the book is, I wanted to start with the cover. It's kind of obvious, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit, just to get to know some of the ideas that you had when defining the cover. I know that sometimes the cover is the last thing that one defines in the book, and sometimes you have an idea in advance. So to start with asking you that, I mean, was it something that you had in mind, or how did you think of the cover as it was?
Well, it was there were a number of things that came together, really. We wanted to connect to our earlier atlas, which is, of course, is a much smaller format of book. But, to have it be, a larger format, that it should, I don't know, that its materiality was very important. And so I had a less than satisfactory experience, actually, when we published our book at the AA. The binding I found disturbing. It was more kind of a stock binding, which had trenches for the hinges. And it was very important that the cover wrap without any kind of disturbance, because we also wanted to, wrap RUR around the book so that there would be no breaks. There is a direct kind of reference actually in this book. There was a beautiful limited edition that Marcel Duchamp made of Alfred Jarry's Ubu Wa, which was, a play that he did at the turn of the last century, which used UBU and actually cut out the letters. So it was a very kind of fancy leather binding with the letters actually joined together without any kind of space in between. That we couldn't do, but there is really a direct reference to the Duchamp Ubu book in the way we designed it. Accidentally, when you see the cover of the book, you don't see the entire U, so it looks like JR, which was a complete accident, although Nanako is blaming me for that. But we were looking at colors very carefully. I was also referencing back to my experience with Rossi and the blue notebooks, which I think he was looking at Kafka. He was looking at Kafka's notebooks and also school books. So canary yellow was a kind of color that would be allied to the blue, to the kind of blue. And so I went on a wild goose chase looking for the right color yellow, and especially that skiver text, which is what that cover of material is. The canary color was very hard to find. It's actually not a very functional color at all for a book because it gets dirty very quickly. So I was actually looking at Florentine leather, like a certain color of leather glove, and I was trying to kind of find a color in Chinese catalogs that would match that. So yeah, there were a lot of concerns about the feel and the aesthetic and the mood of the cover, that it be right. And Princeton Architectural Press were really generous in terms of the entire book, that we got most, I would say like 95% of what we wanted, to materially for the book. The book as an object.
Yes, the cover is this is stamped or is it carved?
It's stamped, and I actually did prototypes in the office too. Of the embossing. So we made a lot of mock-ups and physical models to test out the cover internally.
And the font type of the cover is the same as in the atlas, or is it different?
It's different. It's different.
I can remember that.
The serif type, but the atlas had actually a Bible type.
Okay. So how soft is the cover? How soft or hard is the cover? Does it fold?
Yeah, you mean the softness of the binding? Yeah,
the softness of the cover itself. Is it?
Yes, it's sort of between a hard cover and a soft cover, which was important. That it not be as rigid as the kind of typical binding, but we also didn't want it as flimsy as a hard cover, so it was a balancing act there as well.
And it's larger than the sheets themselves, no? It's a little. The covers are larger. Right?
Yes. Yeah, there's an overhang, which was whereas the atlas was cut flush.
Yes. Yeah. And the rounded corners.
And that was also something I wanted for the atlas, but they wouldn't give me at the time.
Okay.
I didn't like the flush cut actually. But we were looking at old books. I mean, in that sense, it was a kind of antiquarian adventure. I was looking for the atlas. We were looking at Swiss mountain guides, and those had the overhang, but the budget prevented the overhang in our first book. But since the atlas sold well, we were able to get more, concessions in terms of the production of this book.
Okay. Maybe as an introduction, you can tell me a little bit about the title of the book. Like, why did you put, where that title comes from? What's the agenda behind the title?
We had been talking about this book since 2006. I've had regular conversations with people like Sanford Quinter or Jeffrey Kipnis. And so Kipnis actually suggested this title. It was also kind of tied to how one would, present their work in the context of other work. And many monographs don't really look at a wider context. For projects, they're mainly, presenting the projects either in chronological order or typologically or functionally or what have you, but they rarely, get into the wider, I would say, cultural context for the book. I mean, most of the projects aren't built, so we don't have occasion to look at, or to speak to users as such, but we really wanted to, both as a kind of record, but also in a way as a kind of propaganda for the discipline, in support of the discipline, that you're always interacting with a wider, group of people, be they other architects, the engineers you work with, the historians, the critics, the students, that, this is the culture. So you're not ever really the solitary author of the work. It's really part of a network of people and of opinions and of forces, around the work. And so that was really the ambition behind, projects and their consequences.
Because, I mean, in a way that differentiates itself from two things at the same time. One is the monograph as a presentation of projects, as a kind of factual presentation of projects. The other is the contextualist, the idea of context of what an architectural production is, not seen as a precondition of the architecture, but as a kind of effect of architecture, right? So in that sense, it's more kind of, let's say that the fact that the title has this structure of projects under consequences talks about the context that is being built by architecture, rather than a context that gives the preconditions for architecture, right?
Right, that's right. And I mean, quite honestly, it's a confection. So we're creating the audience at the same time as we're responding, let's say, to an audience or to consequences. It's a constructed thing. And I think that's important, that you, in a way, you create the culture by doing this, even if it objectively may not be so clear.
So, I mean, this is only descriptive. It's mostly what Manuel was introducing before, the structure of the book being organized in basically 4 parts, beyond the front matter and the back matter, the introductory parts and the credits, and these 4 parts being composed by projects and essays or diagrams or would you say that those, for example, would be samples of some of the consequences then?
Yes,
So,
yes.
But in that sense, those texts, how do they work in the continuum of the projects? Like, how much are they kind of feeding back the process?
I mean, there were a number of different kinds of texts, and I guess they have different functions. And this is all retrospective in the book, but we very, determined that, there were projects that we had done. Most of, again, were not built, but we were fortunate enough to be, teachers and in a cohort of people who would also publish or write about the work. And so, given the 30 some odd years, there were writings contemporary to the projects that we included that way. Then, there were other kinds of texts, which, like the introductory texts, which are, from me, which are probably they're more retrospective and projective at the same time. Yeah, so there are different, types of texts that we were really, I mean, we had a loose structure. We were as interested in, seeing how the images and the text felt together. and we, so there was a kind of loose collection, of material, the plates, the texts, the projects. And then we began to kind of work with them and actually react directly to these constellations and, edit it that way, rather than, predetermining everything. So we had a kind of a rough structure, but then, work directly with the material itself.
Mm-hmm. But it's also the
to create a world, right? I mean, it was really trying to create a world within the book. And this was something that I had, discussed with Sanford Quinter, because I was sort of at a loss about what to do with the projects at first, how to conceive of them together. And he suggested the idea that this be a wonder cabinet, which, was a kind of 19th century function, or 18th to 19th century, where, a collection of really disparate material could be brought together, and would resonate and, produce its own peculiar world or worlds.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, the book, I mean, we'll go back to the Wonder Cabinet that you're mentioning now, probably later, but one of the things that the book has as a sort of structure, and it's always difficult to do a monograph in that respect, no? It's like that it has many different registers or structures or tones to it, no? So there is, for example, this one that we are seeing here in the contents page appears to be structured thematically or in terms of types of projects, but then at the same time it has a sort. There is a rough chronology about it as well.
Yes.
So in that sense, it could also be seen as a progression, no, or as a continuum, as a continuous construction that progresses or that unfolds.
Yes.
How would you describe it in that sense? I mean, how do you relate the themes or the registers that are in the structure with the progression?
It was sort of a balancing act, really, between thematic and chronological, and it also is a structure that anticipates either one more volume or two. And so these were the most adequate categories, I would say, to divide the work, although there could be others. I mean, there's nothing absolute about them. But the idea was that there would be, there would be a chronological trajectory to it, but it also, could be divided into themes, and then there would be refrains to themes, in later work. So we put, a smaller piece of work, like representing our two projects that are nearing completion in Taiwan. We have some, fairly minor representations of them in this book, and then they're going to receive, more complete treatment in later volumes. So it's also anticipatory.
Mm-hmm. But there is also
it's a confection, I would say. I mean, in that sense, it's not rigorously chronological, nor is it rigorously thematic. It sort of hovers between the two. And I was looking at Edmund Tufte's wonderful books, where he, he's a graphic designer, teaches at Yale, and there's a whole series of books where he talks about conveying complex information in various ways. So, it's the closest we could find to a structure that would be adequate to describing how we work and how the work is embedded in a wider culture of projects by others too.
But there are also, I think that there are, now that you are talking about it, I was also having in mind this sort of hybrid reading between these two registers, but then there are others as well. There is a third or even a fourth understanding of what you are saying. One is because I was thinking, okay, first you're presenting a narrative, then you're presenting diagrams, then you're presenting an infrastructure, and then you're presenting the cultural institution. No? So that could also be read as a sort of hypothesis or a double hypothesis. That's why I say that maybe these are two readings. The first one being a hypothesis about the progression of architecture culture in the last 30 years or 40 years, that you could say that it evolved more or less through those stages, right? In itself as a sort of block of knowledge, no? In which you also took part and was you guys were an important agent in that progression. But then that's one, and that the other reading is that these four could be read as levels of levels that are embedded in any project.
Yes.
No?
Yes.
That are more primary, so to speak, or more intuitive. Then they are more pre-organizational. Then they are more understanding architecture as an infrastructural armature. And then they are about configuring through the complexity of that armature of a sort of cultural positioning or a cultural proposition of architecture. No? So in that sense, those four levels are somehow embedded in any project.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see the content page structure through those registers as well, right? So not as types, but as registers of one single construction.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of method, it would be impossible to manage those levels through pre-thinking. But what we did was we had a provisional structure, and then it was really about active manipulation of the material when we saw it together, whether we would emphasize or de-emphasize, or, you know, those levels one can manage very directly once all the material is out in front of you. Sort of, it's an active living process rather than trying to, I don't know, kind of make predeterminations about those categories. So yeah, I mean, sort of, you need to do it. It would actually be part of the way we design too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not conceptual in the sense of preconceived, but that rather, you know, you get the material out in front of you, and of course there's a legacy of prior work that you're advancing, but there's also, you know, the immediacy of the material itself, and that suggests its own order or how to manage the whole thing, you know, sort of, you know, as if one is managing a piece of music, a symphonic structure.
Yeah.
Or maybe an opera.
But it's funny that dual reading, because, I mean, interesting, because there is something at both levels, let's say, at the level of the ambiguity between this being a structure and this being a chronology, and at the level of the thematic accumulation being read as a sort of punctuation of the signs of the times at different times in the past 40 years, and at the same time as all together being embedded in any project, as if time was kind of spatialized, right? So that, there is something at the same time progressive about it, and then at the same time simultaneously present in the set, in the series.
Mm-hmm.
No? That I think it's interesting, and it also relates to something that maybe we can discuss later, that is present in the introduction, that is about the relevance to time, and at the same time the ahistoric condition of architecture. You know, I think it's interesting to see it that way as well.
Yeah, I mean, I actually realized only recently that I kind of suffer from a certain form of synesthesia, which may have had an effect on this book. It's called spatial sequential synesthesia. And so you see time spatially. But that's a kind of an after reading, but I finally figured out what was wrong with me. So it might have an effect on the book. It's a very common form of synesthesia, apparently. Nothing special about it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, usually those defects are virtues, no? Anyway, so but in the preface, then it's interesting because to me that I would like to unlock the mystery that to me presupposes that statement, which is that it could always have been otherwise. No, I think that there is something very interesting in that statement. It's like you give up or you give out any form of dogma, if you want. It's like there is something. It's like you take distance from anything that has to do with the kind of truth about it, right? I mean, it's like it could be otherwise. At the same time, there is something that is particularly precise in the form of the book, in the form you see your work. It's not. There is. I wouldn't call it a form of truth, but there is something that cannot be otherwise in the form of the book, or in the, let's say, not even in the form of the book only, in the way one thinks of or you think of architecture somehow, no, or one thinks in general of architecture. So no, I would like to unlock that sentence.
Yes.
If you can help me.
Well, I don't know. This is something I had been thinking about. Actually, Sanford Quinter talked about kind of two different sort of approaches. I mean, he made a kind of corollary between critical theory and paranoia, and perhaps the way he would be kind of thinking, which would be closer to a Deleuzian model, which would in some way involve a kind of schizophrenia. So I suppose part of the motive too, although this is a completely retrospective book, and so it appears like everything is over, is inevitable and determined. At any moment, there would be some other influence which could move the project in a different direction. So in a way, it's I wouldn't call it a critique exactly of the critical, but I always felt, given the different levels that go on in an architectural project, the technological, the cultural, the social, that there is a fair amount of chance in the way those things come together, rather than reading, a kind of determinism from historical conditions or social conditions or economic conditions around a project.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a veiled, I hate to say critique, but it goes against the kind of determinism that also shapes architectural projects, where you look at the context, you look at the history, you make, some value judgment relative to these forms of context, and that that there's actually much more kind of openness and freedom and chance involved in the way projects and institutions come together.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting, the question of the retrospective, because you're actually, I mean, the book is a retrospective look at your works, but
retrospectively, it all looks inevitable.
Yeah.
But or maybe it should.
Do you think it looks inevitable or it is inevitable?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say.
Because I mean, obviously, I mean, the reading that retrospective.
I mean, it's but I was just saying, as an architect, you're managing all of these levels, or trying to negotiate them, and they kind of have their own times and their own durations, and this is what you get,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
No, but it's interesting to oppose the idea of apparently inevitable chance to the question of determinism. No, it's like it's not. To me, it's a complex idea of chance. It's not just chance against determinism, but it's a form of chance that takes a form. No, it's a
right.
It's a chance
because each of the levels have their own form too. I mean, each, if you're looking at the structural engineering, or if you're looking at the institution that you're intersecting with, they're not just anything and anything. They actually have their own trajectory and limits, so it isn't vague.
Yeah.
But at the same time, these, if architecture is understood as a kind of assemblage of all of these concerns, yeah.
Maybe that relates to my second point in that is highlighted in pink in the bottom, which is the fact that the book has at least these two readings. One is, you say this book is about telling our story, but also is a plea for the continuation of an architectural culture that is presently under threat from corporate domination from above and the quotidian profession from below. So in that sense, that also relates to this question of how senseful chance can become, right? Something like that. Like how, let's say you are apparent. I mean, the book is full of anecdotes and personal references and personal alliances and friendships, and exchanges that appear to be minor sometimes, but then they all take part in a larger history, I wouldn't say, and not simply in a personal story.
Yes.
And in that sense, that larger history that is not about historical determinism. It's about rather it's more like a form of construction. Gives sense to that sort of particularity of the evolution of the work.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that's related to this dual condition of this apparent monograph that is especially presented as kind of loaded with affection or affective conditions, but then also the necessity or the urgency even of putting that forward in the present, at the present, no?
Yes. No, it's, because there's anxiety in producing the entire book that we're, trying in a sense to memorialize a whole series of situations and, projects so that they're not lost. I feel more and more that sense of urgency, a kind of forgetting, because I do have absolute faith, maybe misguided, in the importance of architecture and in the continuance of architectural culture, because it's not guaranteed at all. And I can already see, large chunks of experience, just going away in my experience teaching. histories of projects that, or, even peculiar situation where like been there, done that. Why are you revisiting postmodernism again? What is this? I mean, there are situations like that all the time. And so part of this is, a kind of recording and a memorialization of the culture we were and are embedded in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's ideological too. It's like a plea for the continuance.
Yeah. In that sense, I mean, you just after that, you talk about a conservative position, and which relates to what you are saying now. I mean, it's interesting because the idea of conservatism has grown in time. I mean, somehow it has always been there, but at the same time, the need to put it on the table as a position, even, or let's say it moved from something that is implicit in the production of the work to something that becomes explicit, or let's say provocative first, explicit after, and even urgent at the moment. No.
Yes.
I don't know. It's interesting the coexistence. Not only the coexistence, the mutual the intertwinement and the mutual need between forward-looking practice and conservatism. No.
Yes.
In that sense.
Well, the whole book project is anachronistic in some way. I mean that it's we're using a very old form, and much of it was about reveling in recovering structures that are really old and very useful in unpacking complex material than say videos or GIFs or those kinds of platforms. Where so it's probably could be correlating to things like slow food, that it's not easily, or it's something that's consumed more slowly. And so there is something wonderful in the structure of books that allows that kind of unfolding and that kind of layering to occur. Yeah, so we were, I mean, we're antiquarians at some level with the book. I wasn't going to, even the use of the graphics and, the way the book is structured is traditional more than it is, we're not really experimenting so much with novel graphic design, but looking at, older books, like there was an old book that I found at the American Academy in Rome called the Celestial Atlas, which had a huge impact on our first book, but even more, that the book was ideally suited, to deal with more intricate material that has to be absorbed slowly, slow things down.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the effects are fast, the technique is not.
At the beginning of the introduction, and I quote you, you say, and I think it relates to this, that architecture will become ever more itself while at the same time becoming everything other than what architecture is today. And I think that kind of, in a way, crystallizes what we are discussing now, in a way, very clearly. There is a sort of paradox in that is, I think, very interesting. It's like by changing and by going beyond itself, it nothing but becomes itself. And that's the way of becoming architecture, so to speak.
Yes.
So architecture is not really in the foundations; it's actually in I mean, there is something conservative, but also forward-looking about that.
I mean, that's what we're trying, you know, we've been negotiating that for years.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, now, and I think this is, at this point, you are more, in a way, belligerent or more directly related to the discussions that are going on nowadays as well,
yes.
No? Or problematics that are now more present, both in academia and in the profession, no?
Yes.
So in that sense, what we're talking, it's also very much, if you want, a reaction or a sort of position against or resisting some of the sign of the times, let's say, no?
Yes.
In terms of
yes.
So you talk about, for example, the question of interdisciplina or the multidisciplina. Sorry.
Oh, interdisciplinarity. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you talk about that, and at different times you present the fact that, you know, paradoxically, architecture, the best way of interdisciplinary pools work is by staying in their own, each part staying in their own discipline and mediating, no, what the others say, and so that to me is an interesting position, because at the same time you are proposing a kind of interdisciplinary presence of architecture or kind of disposition of architecture, and at the same time you're presenting the need to stay put within that context, no, rather than merging.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I quoted Stan Allen, my colleague,
yes,
you know, very well, and I think he's, you know, to my mind, he's dead on with that. I mean, all too often we find in schools of architecture, especially, you know, architects trying to become amateur statisticians, anthropologists, even, you know, kind of statistical planners. And I think, you know, it's important to work with all of them, with engineers too, but there also are very distinct ethos. There's a distinct ethos between how an engineer would work and how an architect would work. And so, of course, we overlap, but there's also a kind of very distinct differences between, you know, the two. So, for example, I mean, we could argue, you know, I mean, make the argument in the book about, you know, the issue of sustainability, which we all, you know, embrace. You know, it's a necessity, it's critical. But at the same time, you know, if sustainability ultimately deals with kind of large statistical consequences and real consequences in the world, they're mainly critical at the level of performance, and almost, you know, so I give as an example the Tom Main Cooper Union building and the work by Robert Stern for the Bush Library, both of which, you know, received LEED Platinum kind of ratings on the basis of their performance. So their equivalent kind of performance criteria are met, but the architecture couldn't be more different. So something is falling out there, right? I mean, so from the perspective of an engineer, though, they're the same building, or, you know, they meet the criteria quantitatively. So that's the kind of, you know, difference, I would say.
In that sense, you present this idea of the fictive universe, right? So let's say that there is the way in which architecture engages with those other fields is not by kind of melting down with them or becoming them, but rather by indexing their logics in the construction of, maybe I'm wrong in what I'm saying, but that's what I would call the fictive universe, no? Like you construct the fictive universe, or you also call it factual fiction, or something like that. In a way, by means, but then also autonomously from those sources, no? So in that sense, I would like you to, if you can expand on that idea, not only in general, but actually in particular to your fictive universe. To what kind of fictive universe you think you are constructing?
Very hard to answer that. But I think I could say that, if it comes to something like this, I don't know, consideration of an architectural project relative to the structural, there's a kind of strange overlap. I mean, because at once, like, for example, if the project is using a cantilever, there's a kind of desire for the project to float. I mean, it's not just us, but this is an old story. There would be kind of structural techniques to achieve the cantilever, but then there are also completely architectural techniques to allow a building or a component to float with a shadow reveal or a change in material. I mean, I talked about the design of a chaise lounge, which was up on chromed legs. And everybody knows the thing is sitting there, but there's also a kind of a consensus around the use of the chromed legs under the chaise that it's floating. So it's in plain sight, but through consensus and sensibility, everyone agrees that this thing is floating, even though it's, bringing its forces to the floor. So, I mean, it's part of, I guess, architectural sleight of hand or some mutually agreed upon, experience that this thing is levitating, where in fact it's not.
I mean, you also say
what you see and it's always going to be some kind of problem or between what you know and what you see, or what you don't see.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's obviously something hard to say in words.
Yes.
The architecture does it for you, but it's interesting to kind of try to give some hints about how you see it, no, as well, without fixing them, but without fixing those categories, but just to have a sort of constellation of the field, no?
Yes.
Because you also say that great architecture will recast the physical world and its loss into what it ought to be, not into what it is, no?
Yes.
And I think that becomes an imperative, so to speak, or a sort of, it's an imperative by quality, not an imperative by dogma, no? It's like
it's desire. It's how, I mean, if it can't be achieved physically, it's in a literal sense through engineering. It's done through other means. It's attempted anyway.
Yeah, and then when you talk about expression, and I think it relates to this, you talk about the question of expressionism being on the side, at the side, let's say, no, and then it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, just correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that you talk about how, let's say, introducing architectural registers or kind of contradictory propositions, no, through architecture, can also become a form of expressionism. And then to that, you say that then the question of expression of forces then has to be sort of nuanced or has to become self-contradictory, no? It's like, and that's, to me, that's where the question of conservatism appears again. No, it's like your architecture, one could say, is loaded with the question of expression of forces, and at the same time, it resists or it refrains that expression, no? Or it nuances that expression.
Well, it's I guess, I mean, there already is a legacy of a certain kind of expressionism in architecture, or architect like Calatrava's work would be solidly on the side of engineering expressionism, and it has its own limits, and in a way, it's sort of an extreme, but that it would be notionally more interesting to kind of dial back that and to kind of find other kinds of expressions that wouldn't be so purely, in the category of engineering expressions, that matter and forces can do that. But I almost see it all, everything is expression, some form of expression.
So why would you say that form of nuanced and self-contradictory expression of forces to the point that it becomes sort of refrained or kind of it works backwards somehow? In what sense would you say that is a world worth living in, as you also mentioned, no? It's like that's what architects do, create worlds worth living in rather than livable worlds, no?
Yes.
In what sense do you think it's worth?
Well, I mean, I think it even goes back to not living by bread alone. I mean, if the sustainability folks, are talking about survival ultimately, which is real, right? There's also the quality of the life that you live. So you're not just eating, it would be the same thing with, food. I mean, you could be given the chemical constituents to keep you alive, or you could be put on a life support system. And what kind of life would that be? You would be kind of, dealing with all the quantitative material, but then it would be a life without, or with very limited quality.
Well, maybe we can go into some of the plates. I know that this is not structural to the work, but I find it interesting to maybe discuss what we're talking about now through, and we'll come back to that as well. And at some point in the book, you construct these taxonomies that are also kind of framed framed, I would say, through these very general categories that I don't know how you think of them. These being branches, broad net systems, it comes after, bricolages, geodetics, agglomerates. So maybe we can go. I mean, how do you think of these five? How do you call them? How would you call them?
Well, they probably would fall into the strange category of, was it Foucault talked to, maybe it was from Borges, about Chinese encyclopedia. They're really heterogeneous in many ways, but the categories don't really amount to a completely systematic elucidation of all of those projects. but it was, we assembled these fairly late. And it was almost as if, you know, I kind of looked out at the projects, at this whole lineage of projects, superficially, very lightly. So yeah, they are bound together with certain, I guess, organizational motives, like the branching in this case. With the others, with the RodNet projects, is actually more coherent. It relates to a certain tectonic and structural idea that we were developing. So each one of those plates actually stands in a peculiar way on its own. But I guess to kind of, in general, it was about, you know, gaining some distance from the work, and then producing tables where there were, you know, similarities of various kinds.
Mm-hmm.
The RodNet projects are more, they're elucidated in the book, and there's a trajectory for them. So they do form, at least in our minds, a more coherent, you know, category and more deliberately thought about. But the others are, in a way, more based on, you know, a kind of crude view of each project, how they might be categorized if you looked at just a kind of gross organization of them. So this plate, for example, kind of bridges early work and later work, the kind of passage from collage projects to projects like the Yokohama Port Terminal, which is really a kind of transitional project for us, which has some collage material in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting that the role that these 5 taxonomies have in the global universe of your work, because let's say, as what you are saying now, like this one is one that appears more at the ends, like at the beginning
Yes.
and now, no? Or let's say that there are 10 or 15 years where probably there are no projects here, if I'm not wrong. Like these are projects from the 90s and projects from the last 10 years. Right?
Which one? This one?
No,
this is 80s, into early 90s. The
yes.
really transitional project was a collaboration with Stan Allen for the Venice Gateway, which is that image on the upper right of the plate.
Yes, it's all early actually. Yeah, no,
It's mainly early. Then yeah, there are. What is it?
Yeah, I assume that there were
the BMW project, which is the center in the center at the bottom, you know, is from the 2000s.
Yeah. No, somehow I don't know. I didn't pay attention enough. I thought that perhaps Taiwan was here, for example, and but this one instead, as you were saying, is more like a more program. Let's say it's more like the program of your practice. It's like it's when the practice acquires a sort of I don't know. It's when you take a position in terms of contemporary culture, and you crystallize it, no?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, the logic behind the project is generally I don't know, indebted to Mies, I would say, in the way that, I mean, I was really inspired by the fact that there was a show, you know, at the MoMA on Mies, I don't know, some 15, 20 years ago. And there was a, you know, wonderful explication of his clear span buildings. We actually used that, I think, in the project that we did, you know, at the Di Tella, where there were only 2 types of clear spans. that he worked with. And then he worked through various scales for them, from, you know, the smallest being a house, I guess, and largest being the convention center. But working with a really limited, you know, kind of model, and then applying it to completely different programs and sites. And so that was an insight, you know, for us, you know, that we could find a way of, you know, continuing a project on a fairly rigorous level, but then also, you know, bringing a model to the particularities of the site and the program. And then that's the thing that those considerations work on, rather than starting anew with every project. But it was super clear in Nice. And so I think that was, you know, if not the form of Nice, the way of working was fascinating to me. And Anaco too.
Yeah, I mean, it's more, this one is more like the sort of, I mean, they are like matrices, but at the same time, it's more like a kind of, it's a matricial approach to architecture, no? It's like what is there, no matter what.
Right. I mean, it would be open to the influences of the site and the program and the constraints, but you actually have a working model that, you know, you bring to the project, rather than, I don't know, the fiction of reinventing an architecture every time you get a new project.
Exactly. Yeah. And this one is the branches one. I think it's a different kind of cut through the work. No, it works more at the question of tactics or techniques, tactical techniques on the one hand, and also at the level of the sensitivity with which you treat geometry as a material problem. No, I mean, it works more as what is embedded in the doings, no, rather than a sort of precondition. No, it's more.
Well, you know, I mean, I think the other thing is probably just the legacy of interest in figuration. And so, I mean, this is again a kind of retrospective reading of it, but we got really interested in, you know, that there's a kind of, I mean, even Stan Allen has kind of written about, you know, figure and field, or Peter Eisenman. And at some level, these are objects that are fields that are figured. I mean, there's a consistency across, you know, that those were very interesting, you know, for us, because you wouldn't see the object as an inert block, but that using, you know, a very fine geometry, that the thing, the object, which is, you know, mainly understood as being inert, could actually undergo localized change. So there was a kind of biologism in it as well, I would say. You know, like you'd never just deal with a figure ground situation. There was always a finer geometry that could be affected, and it would then resonate with structure, resonate with tectonics, you know. It would be a more sensitive way of working at different levels. You're working with both the general and the particular by doing this.
It also stays at the level of, let's say, tissues, no, rather than structures. It works more at the level of, you know, the flesh and the tissue.
Correct. Yeah, in many respects. I mean, it took me years to realize that these weren't structural. I mean, there was a kind of misguided assumption I had that, you know, these would somehow be inherently structural, which in many ways they're completely irrational, purely from a structural point of view.
Yeah.
I mean, I was, you know, fascinated with Nervi's diagrams, you know, of, I can't remember, it was a kind of waffle slab plate, which, you know, followed the isostatic lines. But, you know, there are problematics to that as well, you know, that they are a kind of abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess they sort of are self-fulfilling, you know, if they follow those lines, that's where the forces will go. But that was, you know, something that, I don't know, hovered around the work for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it also, there is a certain temporality to these ones, no? I mean, it's like what is this? What would you say? It's like late 90s to 2010s.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's kind of halfway between kind of the preliminaries, more figurative, more appearance related, and the more programmatic, structural, matricial.
Right. I mean, we're still doing it.
No?
I mean, this is a model of a project we just, you know, submitted for the subways in Salzburg, Austria. So, you know, I almost think this is like the, you know, the finest project of the 19th century. But yeah, I mean, these obsessions continue.
Yes, yes. No, I was not trying to kind of lock them in a certain moment. It was only that I found it interesting, this status that these projects have in terms of not being neither tissues nor knots, no, nor they are kind of muscular in a way. They are like,
yes,
there is something muscular to them, but they're not structural, and the muscular aspects are subtly there. They are not. In that sense, I think that relates to the question of expression being refrained.
Well, like, yeah, I mean, they would fit into, I don't know if I have to reference philosophers, but it fits into a kind of way of working with a diagram, which is probably very much against the way, say, most of the Dutch do it. And the interesting, you know, that it would be closer to the work of Francis Bacon, or how Deleuze writes about Francis Bacon, where, you know, you project these drawings, or this way of working enables you to project very precise information into them. So if your bias is more towards the structure, this would guide your way of thinking through structure, but they could equally be, you know, looked at for their tectonic possibilities. So it's a way of working, I think, that allows you to kind of peer into different levels of the object, and they are ambiguous. It requires that you project knowledge or a system into them in order to kind of work with them. But it's much better than a blank page, right? I mean, it's sort of much better than a figure ground representation or a piece of blue foam, which is fairly inert. I mean, that there are other ways of, you know, designing, but this technique allows one to deal with the general and the particular at the same time.
Maybe the geodetics are the structural within that, or let's say it's a kind of further move into the structural, no, of the muscular going into the structural, or this can work in between the rod and net and the previous ones, no, the branches, no, because it's like they are kind of articulating structurally the branches or the singularities.
Right. Well, I mean, the reference comes from an engineer, Barnes Wallace, who worked with very similar, you know, geometrical ideas as Bucky Fuller, but was much more flexible in the way that he deployed geodetics or geodesics, and was also influenced by you know, the kind of the work of Darcy Thompson. And so that, almost predates all of this. I was looking at that work even as a teenager. I was fascinated with the kind of basket weave structures and the way he applied those systems to aircraft. The importance being that the aircraft's form actually pre-existed the system. He projected the system onto a form developed in a different way. And then you got all kinds of incredible, sort of pregnant with the potential for architecture, much more to me than Fuller, where, I don't know, the system was too pure. And so it was very hard, that was the critique of Johnson and others, that what Fuller did with the domes was more like sculpture. It was somewhat unfair, but that it was hard to put a window or a door into a Fuller dome, whereas the working method of Barnes-Wallis allowed for those kinds of inclusions, foreign elements or changes, localized changes to the system.
And then we have the agglomerates that I don't know how to put them together with the rest. How do you see this?
The agglomerates? Well, how would I put it? I think it has to do with work that was very, really at the beginning of our practice, or even when I was doing my thesis, where I was very interested in the kind of objecthood, of the architecture, and was highly influenced as well by Duchamp's work and the Malik molds, and that at some level, that interest never left us. We never did pure surface projects. We never really, we began very early in creating composites in our work. And I was, even influenced by Venturi in that regard. I mean, he lodged a very serious critique against Mies, like that, could Crown Hall sustain the presence of a Coke machine, for example? How, would it ruin the architecture? And so that has always been an interest of mine as well, the idea of aggregates or inclusions, putting material in from the outside that would affect the system that you were working with.
So would it be possible to somehow speculate on how these five, I don't know how to call them, but let's say components of construct the universe of your work? It would be interesting to kind of hypothesize or speculate on how they construct that, what I was asking you before about this fictive universe that you were talking about.
It's very hard for me to articulate it because I'm in it. But on a practical level, I think these are working models. These are models that in reality, I wouldn't even separate them out. These are, ways of operating on any particular project. And to some degree, probably every project has some element of these categories in them.
Okay.
But I didn't really answer your question.
It's okay, no worries. Maybe you can tell me how it feels being there.
I can't tell you that. I only, I hope the book, would produce its own sort of feeling and atmosphere.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we can leave it there for now, and I don't know if Manuel will want to bring us any questions, but I think it's you gave us an interesting take on the book and what the book shows, both in terms of the status of the book, the character of the book, the way in which it is composed, the feel. So thank you, Jesse, for that. It's a pleasure. So
yes, I think we might be receiving questions through the chat of the webinar. Okay, but maybe while we wait, I can make a question of my own. I think it's a quite naive question, but at some point we were discussing about purity and composites, and I was just wondering, not theoretically, but in the experience, how do you deal with the drive of purity, and how do you refrain it, or how do you love impurity, and which are the techniques and architectural techniques for that?
I think it's more. It would be more a question of how you deal with everything outside of, or that is apparently outside of what you're proposing. How receptive you are as an architect to everything outside of the model you're working with, and whether the model you're working with would be would be robust and responsive enough to deal with contingency, and would also kind of incorporate contingency. So I think, yeah, it's part of it's also an ethos, I suppose. And it does come out of, readings of postmodernism, I think, as well. I mean, like that, I realized that, in fact, the Rodnet project almost is a Venturian project, although it doesn't look like Venturi. It fits into many of the arguments that Venturi delivers, not the forms he works with. So I made a rigorous diagram of the 5 points of Corbusier, and then I compared Corbusier's 5 points and his diagrams to our Sagaponic house, and I realized that practically everything was sort of a hybrid. It's a hybrid of the categories of the 5 points. So it's both in the ground and out of the ground. The structure is both, it's both structure and decoration. It actually, on a systematic level, retrospectively, kind of, very clearly produces hybrids from the Corbusian 5 points. I wish I have the diagram to kind of show it, but it was like shocking. But again, it was like a retrospective analysis of the material. So it's a Venturi project. But I find that really interesting in terms of authorship too. So much is made now, especially of attacking authorship. But you realize when you're involved with architectural projects, you're having conversations with ideas and people, and it's not just you. It's not so subjective. It's pretty impersonal.
We have a question from the audience. I don't know if you want to read it, Manuel. Or...
Yes. Yeah, would you read it? Because, yeah.
It says, I feel the effect, it comes from Ana Font, and it says, I feel the effect of your book by means of the projects that it includes and how are they organized is a sort of shock on contemporary discussions. I think it might be one of your intentions But would you be happy with the projects becoming weapons to re-territorialize, I would say, guide or influence disciplinary discussions?
Would I be happy if what? I'm sorry.
With the projects becoming weapons to guide or influence on disciplinary discussions?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's the whole intention of, of the book. That there were weapons that, whose missiles hit us, and then we're sending the arrows out again. I mean, I'd be really happy if the book had an effect that way. Not sure if it does, but that would be, very much, part of the ethos of the book. So it doesn't stand as a kind of singular work, but that it's part of a conversation within the discipline, and hopefully, has its effects in the world.
I mean, it's hard actually, in the sense of I'm thinking of concrete audiences and how dominant some of the trends to, I don't know, specialization or considering problems that are there as if they were architectural problems, considering, I don't know, questions of sustainability or politics, right, or activism as being understood as literally architectural instead of mediating them or
yes.
It's a hard, it's a difficult task, mission, which we're saying nowadays.
I mean, we also have to bring some humility to it. Like it would be almost immoral to assume that architecture can solve all these problems.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, we have one question from Juan Cruz Regino. He's a student at the school. He says, how important in the final result are the methodologies in order to achieve the project regarding contemporary takes on object-oriented ontology, and some of the West Coast architects and designers lying mostly on results and effects?
That's a heavy question. I assume you're referring to work coming out of SCI-Arc when you talk about West Coast designers, or I'm not sure, but
I guess.
I think, one of the challenges now is the predominance of the image in architecture. That while it's super important, and I don't want to denigrate work on representation, there are many levels in an architectural project which might finally result in representations or images. But I think many times now the effects are looked at without considering the causes, I suppose, or the deeper levels in a work. So there's a lot of work being done at the level of image, which stays at the level of image. One begins almost to think that that's all there is. I mean, that then in a way one is working with a picture of architecture rather than architecture, the kind of the material ramifications of architecture. So I don't know if I'm really answering the question, but yeah. I mean, I think it's something to be aware of, that the kind of dominance of the image, or when the image becomes significant in an architectural project, has to be considered very carefully.
Okay.
I mean, you know, I kind of give the example of like there would be manifold images of a nuclear weapon going off, and it produces heat and light, and you know, it's spectacular. But there's another level. In order to create that device, it wasn't about entering into the image realm. That was sort of a byproduct of a whole other set of processes. And so I think that's something one would want to be aware of.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this time with us today. It was really nice to chat, as we always do, and I think it was very rich to me, at least, and I think to the wider audience. And hopefully we can see each other very soon.
Yes, absolutely. It was an absolute pleasure. And again, I wanted to thank you, Ciro, and Manuel for putting together the exhibition. And it's gratifying that there's appreciation from your side on our work. So thank you.
Thank you.
From myself and from Nanako.
Yes, please thank Nanako from us as well.
Okay. Many thanks, Jesse, for this conversation. And the exhibition is now open. We invite everybody to visit the exhibition at the Galería at Di Tella, and the virtual exhibition, you can find the link in the description of the YouTube video. And yeah, once again, thanks for your time and very enriching conversation.
Bye, Jesse.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.